In a town cloaked in fog and the stench of sickness, whispers spread of a house where hope went to die. The year was 1845, and Margaret Whitmore, the doctor's widow, presided over the dying with a peculiar devotion. Her husband had been a respected physician, yet Margaret's care carried secrets darker than any fever or plague. Beneath the old church at the edge of town, hidden from sunlight and conscience, a network of orphans waited, hungry, pale, and silent. Margaret's patients, weakened by illness or poverty, were not merely treated, they were delivered to the children below, sustaining them in ways no one dared imagine. The townspeople noticed her patients vanishing, but no one suspected the depths of the church's basement, where suffering and starvation intertwined with ritual. Could mercy and monstrosity truly coexist? And who would dare uncover the truth beneath the sacred halls? In 1845, the Whitmore estate stood at the edge of town, a tall, gray structure shadowed by the spire of the church that loomed nearby. Margaret Whitmore, widow of the esteemed Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, moved through its halls with the grace of someone accustomed to authority. Though her husband had been the town's physician, the estate's true purpose was whispered only behind closed doors, a sick room where the destitute came for care, but few left unchanged. The patients who arrived were already weak, many dying from fevers, consumption, or malnutrition. Margaret greeted them with gentle hands and soft words, her demeanor a balm against their suffering. Candles burned low in the corners, and the scent of herbs mingled with the sharper odor of illness. But beneath the comforting surface, Margaret observed each visitor with meticulous care, noting who might be of use and who might not survive the night. The townspeople trusted her. They brought their sick and elderly to her door, believing her skill and compassion would deliver salvation. Yet, Margaret's care was selective. Some patients were tended to with medicine and comfort, others were quietly prepared for a different fate. Beneath the estate lay a hidden passage, a stairwell descending into the church's basement, a place most children feared, and most adults avoided. Here, orphans waited, a small, pale community kept from sunlight and warmth, hungry and silent. Their sustenance was peculiar, ritualistic, and supplied in secret by Margaret. Even the servants whispered uneasily. Candles would flicker without wind, and soft footsteps echoed in empty hallways. The estate itself seemed to pulse with expectation, as if aware of what occurred beneath its flaws. Margaret maintained the illusion of domestic normalcy. Tea in the morning, letters neatly stacked on the desk, the garden trimmed and orderly. Yet beneath, the orphans stayed, eyes wide in anticipation of what was to come. It was in this duality, caregiver above, provider of darkness below, that Margaret Whitmore exercised her power. The sick room was a stage, the patients both actors and sacrifices in a play whose audience existed only in shadows. Every arrival, every treatment, brought her closer to fulfilling a hidden, horrifying purpose, feeding the children she had taken under her charge, while the town slept, oblivious. And Margaret knew, the basement beneath the church waited, patient, hungry, and eternal. Beneath the old church, a narrow staircase descended into darkness, spiraling into a low-ceilinged basement that smelled of damp stone and something fouler, human sweat, decay, and hunger. Here, the orphans lived, a small, pale colony of children abandoned by the world above. They were not merely neglected, they were trained, disciplined, and fed only at Margaret Whitmore's discretion. Every meal, every morsel, came at a cost, the patients who entered the estate's sickroom above. The children were quiet, their eyes unnaturally alert, scanning every shadow, every sound from above. They had learned early that the world outside had no mercy. Their survival depended entirely on Margaret, whose presence they both feared and revered. She walked among them like a warden, tallying needs and rationing sustenance with precise, unyielding control. Even a slight misstep could mean starvation, and the orphans had long learned the rhythm of fear and obedience. The basement itself seemed alive. Stone walls wept with condensation, echoing faintly with the drip of water. Candles flickered in iron sconces, casting moving shadows that appeared to twist into grotesque forms. Margaret's patients, lowered by stretcher or carried in frail arms, were placed in corners, their weakness rendering them silent. The children gathered in semicircles, their eyes fixed on the newcomers, anticipation palpable in their thin bodies. Margaret's methods were methodical. She never hurried, never faltered. She guided the sick into the basement with a calm efficiency that belied the horror of her purpose. The orphans, pale and hungry, watched as she attended to the patients, offering touches that were tender yet final. Every drop of life she drew sustained the children below, granting them strength for another day. Yet there was an eerie pattern. The children seemed to recognize who was next, their whispers barely audible. She chooses well or badly. Margaret herself was silent as the river of life flowed through her control, aware that each decision balanced life above and survival below. Outside, the town slept, unaware that the sick room above was merely the entrance to a secret world of hunger and dark devotion. The orphans, though young, were predators in their own right, learning to survive on what others discarded. Margaret's influence extended beyond medicine. It shaped them into something uncanny, something that could endure even the darkest shadows. And in the basement beneath the church, the waiting never ended. Each patient who arrived at the Whitmore estate became part of a delicate, horrifying balance between life and death. Above, Margaret Whitmore presented the image of a devoted widow, her hands steady, her eyes sympathetic. She offered medicine, warmth, and quiet reassurance. Yet every detail, the dosage of tinctures, the meals she provided, the positions in which she laid them, was calculated to weaken certain individuals, preparing them for the descent below. The sick room, suffused with the scents of camphor, herbs, and faint decay, became a threshold. Those chosen for the orphans' nourishment were never singled out immediately. Margaret observed them, recording their strength, resilience, and vulnerability. Some patients lingered for days, drifting between consciousness and fevered delirium, until the moment came when they were deemed ready. Then she would guide them to the staircase that led beneath the church. The journey downward was silent but filled with tension. Patients, frail and often too weak to resist, could sense the change in the air, the oppressive weight of stone and shadow. Candles lined the walls of the stairwell, flickering and throwing the walls into grotesque motion. Whispers echoed from below, soft but insistent, as if the orphans themselves were calling the newcomers to join them. At the basement threshold, the children waited, eyes glinting like fire in the dim light. They watched Margaret carefully, learning the rhythm of her movements, recognizing the patients who would become sustenance for another week. The air was thick, scented with sweat and faint iron, carrying the unmistakable promise of something final yet necessary. Margaret performed her tasks with precision and calm. She tended to the patient's comfort, offering water or a gentle hand, all while preparing them for the inevitable. The orphans, pale and disciplined, accepted their place silently, understanding the exchange. Life above traded for life below. Margaret's presence ensured order in this dark ecosystem, her authority absolute, her purpose unquestioned. Occasionally, a patient resisted, wailing or thrashing against their fate. Margaret handled these moments with careful firmness, soothing them, guiding them, and ensuring that fear did not overwhelm their weakness. Even in horror, there was a perverse tenderness to her actions, a conviction that she was both caretaker and sustainer. And so the patients descended, one by one, into a world of hunger and dependence, their lives feeding those who had been forgotten by the light above. Above, the town remained oblivious. Below, the orphans thrived, each day a testament to Margaret's chilling balance of mercy and monstrosity. In the heart of the church's basement, Margaret Whitmore had established a rhythm that was as precise as it was horrifying. The air hung heavy with moisture, sweat, and the faint tang of iron, carrying the scent of life offered willingly and taken forcibly. Candles and iron sconces cast long shadows, twisting the stone walls into grotesque shapes, like silent witnesses to a ritual older than memory. Each evening, as the last patient descended from above, Margaret guided the orphans through the motions of their sustenance. The children, pale and unnervingly alert, moved with synchronized precision, their thin hands reaching only when commanded. Their small bodies trembled, not from fear alone, but from anticipation, the anticipation of life being poured into them from the living, frail figures that Margaret delivered. Margaret maintained strict rules. Each child was allotted a portion, measured, and distributed in silence. Whispered instructions were followed without hesitation. Eyes down, hands steady, do not waste. The rituals were exacting. Any deviation was corrected immediately, a lesson reinforced with cold authority. The basement, though dark and oppressive, functioned like a theater of survival, with Margaret as both conductor and warden. The patients, often delirious or too weak to comprehend their surroundings, were treated with a perverse gentleness. Margaret adjusted blankets, offered water, or brushed hair from a pale forehead, all while directing the children to take only what was required. Some patients seemed to understand, their eyes meeting Margaret's with fleeting recognition, a mixture of resignation, and strange trust. The orphans, though young, were already predators shaped by necessity. Their senses had sharpened in the darkness. Every shift in sound, every flicker of candlelight, informed their movements. Margaret's influence extended beyond feeding. She had cultivated obedience, patience, and an uncanny awareness of life and death. Even in the darkest corners, the basement seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Shadows stretched and recoiled as though responding to the ritual. The faint hum of the town above was muted here, replaced by whispers, the soft scrape of feet on stone, and the subtle sighs of the patients. By the end of each evening, the orphans were sated, the patients diminished, and Margaret's control reaffirmed. Outside, the church appeared empty and serene, a symbol of piety and care. Below, it was a crucible of survival and horror, a place where mercy and monstrosity entwined under Margaret's steady hand. And yet, Margaret knew the ritual could not last indefinitely. Each life spent above sustained only the fragile balance of the basement below. The cycle would continue, inexorably, as long as the town remained oblivious. By 1846, the once trusting town had begun to murmur suspicions. Patients arrived at the Whitmore estate, seeking care, yet fewer and fewer were seen leaving. Children whispered in the streets of shadows glimpsed beneath the church's spire, and mothers clutched their sickly ones tighter at night. Margaret Whitmore, outwardly composed, carried herself with the same quiet grace, but beneath her calm, she noted every suspicion, every sideways glance, every hushed conversation. The first rumors began subtly. A merchant returning from the estate remarked on the pallor of those who came for treatment. A neighbor noticed a candle burning late into the night in a window that faced the church. Others claimed to hear faint, unsettling noises emanating from a stone basement below. The shuffle of small feet, soft, urgent whispers, or occasional cries that seemed to vanish before they could be traced. Town meetings were called. Officials questioned servants, who offered nothing but vague murmurs and fearful glances. No evidence could be produced. Margaret's carefully maintained image remained untarnished. She answered inquiries with poise, her hand steady, her voice measured, and the townspeople reluctantly accepted her assurances. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted. Travelers spoke in hushed tones of the church, noting that it always seemed darker than surrounding buildings, its windows like eyes observing, and that candles flickered without wind. Mothers warned their children to stay away from the estate, and some avoided it entirely. Still, Margaret's patients continued to arrive, drawn by reputation and desperation, unaware of the horrors awaiting them beneath the floorboards. Even as suspicion grew, Margaret remained in complete control. Every patient, every orphan, every shadow was accounted for. The whispers of the town only sharpened her vigilance. She had created a delicate ecosystem. The sick above sustained the children below, and the town's ignorance maintained her authority. By winter, tension had thickened. Residents glanced toward the Whitmore estate with unease. They spoke of faint sounds in the night, disappearing individuals, and a strange pull over the churchyard. Yet none dared confront her directly, for the widow had cultivated a presence of quiet power and subtle intimidation. The town suspected, but they did not know. And below the church, the orphans waited, hungry, patient, and obedient, while Margaret's hands ensured that the rhythm of life and death continued with unerring precision. By spring of 1846, the rhythm of life and death in the Whitmore estate had grown more precise, more ritualistic. The sick room above the church became a stage for the macabre, choreography that Margaret Whitmore conducted with flawless discipline. Each evening, as darkness fell, the selected patients were quietly guided down the narrow staircase into the basement, their frailty heightened by days of careful observation and subtle weakening treatments. The basement itself was prepared for the feeding. Iron sconces flickered, casting long, twitching shadows across stone walls slick with moisture. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of ice, sweat, and faintly coppery traces of blood. The orphans lined the walls, pale, alert, their eyes reflecting the dim candlelight like hungry stars. They were trained to respond instantly, their movements precise as they awaited the arrival of the new sustenance. Margaret moved among the patients with deceptive gentleness, tending to blankets, adjusting limbs, brushing hair from damp brows. Her voice was calm, measured, soothing in a way that betrayed no hint of the purpose for which the patients had been prepared. The children, meanwhile, understood the unspoken rules: take only what is necessary, make no sound, honor the order, and obey Margaret without hesitation. Some patients moaned, weak and confused, their senses dulled by fever and fatigue. Margaret whispered assurances, her hand steady, and guided them toward the center of the basement. The children stepped forward, small hands reaching carefully, taking only what was allowed, frail fingers grazing skin, drawing sustenance in silence. There was no cruelty in their actions. It was survival, taught and enforced by Margaret's relentless discipline. The basement pulsed with energy, a rhythm of life flowing from the dying above to the fragile bodies below. Every action was deliberate, every gaze measured. Margaret observed, noting strength, compliance, and the balance of each life exchanged. Outside, the church remained quiet, its doors locked and shadows still. Only those inside knew the truth of the feeding, the strange communion between the patients and the orphans, orchestrated by a widow whose devotion was as horrifying as it was methodical. By the time the last patient was spent, the children were sated, pale cheeks flushed with renewed life. Margaret extinguished the candles, the basement falling back into darkness, silent except for the occasional whisper of the orphan's breathing. And in the quiet that followed, Margaret knew the feeding would continue, nightly, unbroken, until the town itself recognized the full extent of her dominion, or until the darkness beneath the church consumed all. By mid-1846, whispers of strange occurrences had begun to ripple through the town. Mothers warned their children to stay away from the Whitmore estate. Travelers spoke of faint screams that seemed to echo from the church at night, muffled yet unmistakable. Some claimed they had glimpsed pale figures moving behind the basement windows, eyes reflecting candlelight even when the house appeared empty. The town was no longer comfortable dismissing rumors as superstition, yet fear kept their voices low and cautious. Inside the estate, Margaret Whitmore maintained her composure, walking the halls with the grace of a woman who understood power intimately. She knew the townspeople were speaking, yet she neither confronted nor appeased them. Her attention remained on the sick room above and the orphans below, a world of shadows where whispers carried meaning only to those trained to listen. The basement hummed softly with anticipation, the faint movements of children waiting for the next patient. The whispers, however, began to manifest in unsettling ways. Servants reported hearing their own names called in the dark, though no one was present. Patients, increasingly pale and weak, spoke of voices that guided them downward, of soft hands brushing their hair and eyes staring from hidden corners. Even Margaret felt it at times, a subtle awareness, as if unseen eyes followed her movements through the estate. The children, attuned to these voices, interpreted them as guidance. They moved with eerie precision, responding to sounds imperceptible to adults. They had become extensions of the whispers themselves, conduits for the estate's dark purpose. Margaret observed quietly, noting that fear had become an instrument, a tool that maintained order and ensured obedience. The town's whispers began to creep closer to truth. Some ventured near the church at night and reported strange rituals visible through the basement grates, shadows gathering around patients, figures bending over them, subtle movements too coordinated to be accidental. None dared confront Margaret directly. Those who attempted were rebuffed with calm authority, or avoided the estate entirely, their fear solidifying the widow's control. And beneath the church, in the darkness where the orphans thrived and the patients were delivered, the whispers persisted. They were a language of survival, of instruction, and of horror, a constant reminder that Margaret Whitmore's dominion was absolute, and that the basement beneath the church held secrets that would never fully leave the world above. The horrors whispered on, patient, inevitable, and eternal. By late 1846, the town's whispers had hardened into a palpable fear. Children no longer dared pass near the church spire, and merchants avoided the Whitmore estate, claiming illness, bad weather, or vague premonitions. Families barred windows and bolted doors at night, yet even in daylight, an uneasy shadow seemed to cling to the estate, a silent testimony to the hidden horrors below. Rumors spread of patients disappearing entirely after their visits, and of faint, distorted cries carried on the wind. A few daring neighbors claimed to see pale figures moving in unnatural harmony through the churchyard at dusk. Some swore they glimpsed shadowy hands reaching from the basement windows or flickering candlelight behind thick stone walls. No one dared enter to investigate, for fear of the unknown, and Margaret Whitmore's reputation as a caretaker remained untarnished, her composure impeccable in the face of suspicion. Inside the Whitmore estate, the tension of the town's fear only sharpened Margaret's vigilance. She maintained her routines with ritualistic precision, observing every patient, every movement of the children, every flicker of candlelight. The basement pulsed with quiet energy, alive with anticipation. The orphans had grown stronger, sharper, attuned to the slightest sound, each knowing the rhythm of the estate and the pace of their sustenance. Servants moved silently, their obedience reinforced by subtle fey. Those who hesitated or questioned were reminded of their place, sometimes with a firm hand, sometimes with the icy reminder that the basement demanded order above all. Margaret had turned fear into a tool, both for the children below and the town above, ensuring her dominion remained unchallenged. Despite this control, the weight of the unseen pressed on everyone in the estate. Patience, though oblivious to the full horror, sensed a difference in the air, a strange, heavy expectancy that gripped the sick room and the staircase leading below. Even Margaret occasionally felt the pull of the shadows, the subtle tug of a world that existed beyond reason, where the orphans and their demands were entwined with the rhythm of life and death itself. And so, as winter approached, the town's fear tightened like a noose around the estate, yet it remained powerless. The Whitmore estate stood as a nexus of dread, a house of care masking a house of predation, with Margaret Whitmore at its center. Beneath the church, the children waited, patient, hungry, and unbroken. By early 1847, the weight of Margaret Whitmore's choices began to press upon her in ways that even her meticulous control could not fully contain. The sick room above the church had become more than a place of care. It was a crucible, where life was measured, rationed, and exchanged for survival below. Every patient who arrived carried the potential for sustenance or death, and Margaret's decisions were absolute. Yet the lines between mercy and monstrosity were blurring. Some patients lingered longer than expected, their fever stubborn, their strength unusual. Margaret, despite her cold efficiency, hesitated at times, caught between genuine compassion and the grim necessity of feeding the children. A misjudgment could lead to starvation or rebellion among the orphans, whose survival depended entirely on the living above. Each hesitation left her unsettled, a gnawing awareness that mercy, however fleeting, might carry consequences she had yet to foresee. The orphans, though disciplined, began testing boundaries. A child reached too far. Another whispered questions that challenged Margaret's authority. The basement, normally a place of rigid order, now resonated with tension, a subtle undercurrent of unpredictability. Margaret responded swiftly, adjusting rations, enforcing rules, reminding the children of their place in the hierarchy. Yet the strain of dependency was evident. Life taken above had to be perfectly balanced with sustenance below. Beyond the estate, the town's unease deepened. The whispers of vanishing patients became harder to dismiss. Some families sought care elsewhere, yet desperation drove others back to Margaret's doors. Each visit carried risk, and the unseen consequences of her choices weighed not only on the patients and children but also on her conscience. Shadows seemed longer, corridors darker, the estate itself seeming to lean in, observing her with a presence she could not name. Margaret began to realize that the mercy she offered, the provision of life to those children, was inseparable from the horror she enacted. Every act of care above the church reinforced the cycle of predation below. And yet, to halt it would mean abandoning the children she had claimed, leaving them to starve in darkness. Her hands were stained not with intention alone, but with the unyielding arithmetic of survival, of lives traded for other lives. By nightfall, as candles flickered across the stone walls, Margaret stood at the threshold of the basement, ledger in hand, contemplating the consequences. Mercy had a price, and the full weight of it pressed on her shoulders. And still, the basement waited, hungry, patient, eternal. By mid-1847, Margaret Whitmore could no longer ignore the toll her actions had taken, not just on the orphans and patients, but on herself. The estate, once a sanctuary of order and quiet control, had grown heavy with an almost tangible sense of judgment. Candles flickered more wildly, shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the basement beneath the church seemed to pulse with a life that mirrored her own unease. Each night, as she guided patients to their fate, Margaret felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her. The orphans, once compliant and nearly instinctive in their obedience, now watched her more closely, their pale faces reflecting subtle unease. She realized that her authority, absolute though it seemed, was tethered to a fragile balance. One misstep could unravel the structure she had so meticulously maintained. Margaret also began to perceive the subtle feedback of her own conscience, magnified by the oppressive atmosphere of the basement. Whispers rose from the stone walls, echoing the cries of those who had been offered, the murmurs of the town's suspicions, and the silent judgment of the children who depended on her for life itself. It was a judgment she could not escape, a reckoning both literal and spiritual, as though the very building demanded accountability for every action taken within its walls. The townspeople, still wary but powerless, continued to feed the cycle unwittingly. Margaret recognized the precariousness of her situation. Each patient that arrived was a lifeline for the orphans, yet also a mark of her growing entanglement in a system she could not abandon. Her wealth, her reputation, and the very survival of those she had claimed were intertwined with acts of mercy that had become indistinguishable from acts of horror. One night, she knelt at the edge of the basement, candlelight reflecting off damp stone, and felt the enormity of her choices. The whispers coalesced into a single, unrelenting question: was she savior or executioner? The orphan's eyes, bright and expectant, seemed to demand an answer she could not provide. The ledger of names she kept, once a tool of control, now weighed upon her like chains. Margaret understood, at last, that judgment had come not from the town, nor from the orphans, nor from heaven. It had come from the life she had orchestrated, from the delicate and terrible balance of giving and taking. And beneath the church, the basement waited, patient, eternal, and unjudging, ready to receive the next consequence of her actions.